well, we're going. Oh, this is joint work with Bob Mooradian, who is not here. Very quick background. First mortgage pass-throughs in 1970, 1980, 11% of mortgages are securitized. By 2008, about 60%. And about a third of those are in non-agency, which means non-guaranteed securities, which means the investors don't have guarantees for it. What the securitizing does is really unbundling three functions: the funding, the origination, and the servicing. And the focus of this paper is all about the unbundling of funding and servicing. I probably won't have time to talk about it at all, but the announcement just came out this morning of an agreement between states and a lot of big servicers. Very relevant for this stuff. I would love to get the details of how they're going to do this. But for now, we're concerned with two contracting problems. There's that between the borrower and the lender, or the investors, and that's present whether you securitize or not. And then there's another contracting problem that's created by the securitization, which is between the servicer and the investors, and these are very much linked. But in this paper, we go even a little further, and so we're going to look jointly at these three things: the design of the mortgage contracts, the servicer contract, and the design of the mortgage-backed security itself. Before you think we're going to try and solve everything, I'm not going to keep you here for 5 hours to go through that. We actually narrow it down a bunch. This is not a result slide. These are the things we actually do in this. So for a mortgage contract, we determine the maximum amount that a lender would be willing to loan as a function of the expected value of the underlying collateral, and also some risk characteristics of the underlying collateral. And then also solve for the promised payment as a function of that. So we can actually say something with our solution about availability of credit and cost of credit. With the servicer contract, we'll determine the loss position that's needed so that you have IC stands for incentive compatible. And that just means such that the servicer will actually have the incentives to do what's best for the investors. But then we also determine conditions such that it's not optimal to have an incentive compatible contract. And I mean optimal from the perspective of the investors. And that point is very important, because what that means is under those conditions, it's actually in the best interest of the investors, let any problem mortgage just go straight to foreclosure. Don't even bother to try to do anything, just let them go. And that I think it's going to have some implications for what's going on now. But then we go one step further with the mortgage-backed. The design of the security, I want to be very clear, we're only looking at one dimension for design. And that is whether the pool of underlying mortgages should be diversified or whether it should be non-diversified. There is no tranching in this paper. And that's not because tranching isn't important. It's incredibly important, but that deserves a paper in and of itself. That will be the next paper. And I think I may convince you by the end of this that we've got enough going on here already. I hope so. Also, our perspective in this is a little different, I think, from what we've seen so far. This is a theory paper, and we do come up with a few empirical implications, but by and large, our approach is really normative. We're really taking this approach of how do we think this should be done? How do we think it can be done better? And so before doing that, we started thinking about, well, what is it that really matters? So if you want to come up with some recommendations that are going to be at all useful, it's important to try and capture what you think are the most important characteristics of the problem. So these are the 5 characteristics. Mortgage contracts are incomplete. For those of you who work in contracts here, I know there are multiple definitions of that. This is the definition that we're using. And that is that there are relevant variables, such as the cash flow of the borrower or the value of the underlying collateral, on which you cannot write an enforceable contract. Where that's going to lead you is there may be a value to renegotiation. Foreclosure is inefficient. We treat that parametrically in the problem. There's no argument about that. In fact, the kind of numbers that get thrown out there is for subprime mortgages that go into foreclosure. Recovery rates on average of probably less than 50%. In some areas, like maybe Ohio, it might be around 20%. Foreclosure definitely is not necessarily where we want to be going. Borrowers, at the time that they make their default decisions, have some relevant information that's available to the lender only at a cost. They would have to actually make an effort, or the servicer would have to make an effort to get this information. Investors in the mortgage-backed security cannot observe the servicer's actions, so this is a moral hazard problem. And the servicers are wealth constrained, and we will treat that parametrically. So here's our solution approach, and I'm actually going to go through and spend some time here talking about results, just in case I don't get all the way through. So we start off looking at just one borrower, one lender, no securitization. And the result there is that renegotiation of mortgage contracts following a default is strictly Pareto improving, but only if the lender gathers updated information. Right? So if there's no information that's going to be gathered, then a few things happen. You get excess strategic default. I mean, it's the optimal thing for everybody to default if you're going to rework people's mortgages. Also, you have either, too much recidivism, and in other words, the reworking just doesn't work, or you have too much of a wealth transfer to the borrower. So you really want to be gathering information, and that's really what the servicer is going to have to do once we securitize these. So then we go to look at the optimal servicer contract. How do you provide incentives for the servicer to actually do this? So we already have one implication here, that saying across the board you got to rework these things without making sure that it's going to be done properly is just opening up a major can of worms. With the servicer contract, you have to give them a share of the MBS proceeds for them to have incentives. And we show how big that might be, but then we also look at the possibility of a wealth constraint such that, let me back up a second. I'll use a little technical stuff here. You'll see this stuff later. But, we always have this incentive compatibility constraint. I mean, that's the whole thing that drives contract design and mechanism design. You assume that people are going to do what's best for themselves. And so you try to design it such that people want to do what's best. And that's the thing that binds here. And it means, that you have to give a slice of the security to them that's actually much more valuable than what it costs them to do the work. But you could require that they actually invest their own money in it. And if you could require them to invest their own money in the mortgage-backed security such that they have the right to do the servicing, then this would all work out. But if they're wealth constrained and they're not able to invest enough money in it, then the investors are going to say, look, it's just not worthwhile giving them the incentives to do this at all. So then finally we look at the design of the mortgage-backed security, and the thing about diversified versus non-diversified is that if you have a diversified mortgage, which is, by the way, what the rating agencies are arguing for. We have a nice quote from the Wall Street Journal of a rating agency saying, look, we're not going to give any AAA ratings to these things because too many of your mortgages are, geographically too close to each other. And so what happens is that when you have this mortgage that's got so much stuff in it, it basically makes all the relevant information soft, and this notion of soft versus hard. So that the servicer really has complete control over it. And so if you can't get an incentive-compatible contract, you will have no information gathering. And you basically are making your mortgages that you've securitized in this way renegotiation proof, which, when you work your way up to the top, is actually suboptimal in this case. But if you have non-diversified pool, then you can actually effectively harden some of that information. You can actually, say if you did your first level of securitization, as non-diversified as possible, all those mortgages are all in the same zip code, then you can actually harden the information in the sense that the investors can get a hold of the information. You can actually contract on this information, and we call these pooling and servicing agreements at the beginning, which can actually solve a lot of problems, even beyond what we're looking at here. So that's sort of the summary of the whole thing. Now I'll actually take you through in a little more detail. A little bit of background first of other literature. Nobody has done anything like this that I know of in terms of putting together this, these two moral hazard problems with the design of the security. There have a bunch of people who have looked at design of securities, though. In all fairness, the DiMarzo paper doesn't recommend diversification across the board. He actually looks at a number of different cases. But both he and Ridio are looking at the problem of adverse selection risk at the time that you put the security together, not at moral hazard after you've put it together. Diamond actually looks at a problem that's very similar to the problem we have here, but his financial intermediary is not wealth constrained. There's some more recent papers that actually do provide support for non-diversification, again, mostly related to the origination problem. I'm actually not going to touch on the origination problem at all. There's actually been some very nice work looking at the origination problem. And so there is some support for non-diversification there. And there's another paper that does actually talk about having incentive fees. This is really a policy paper. So this is written, for policymakers arguing we need incentive fees for servicers. So in our study, we're putting together looking at an agency problem that occurs after securitization, and then putting all these three pieces together. There is no empirical evidence for what we're actually doing. I mean, again, as I said, I don't know of anyone who's looked at this in this comprehensive setting, so nobody has tested these ideas. And I'm really talking about ideas that connect the design of the mortgage-backed security with other things. But there have been some tests that are a little bit related. So there's some papers that show that evidence that mortgages that have not been securitized, that are actually held by the people. 10 minutes? Great.
20 minutes.
Oh, great. Oh, I'm doing fine. We'll finish in time. So they show that, there is actually more renegotiation and less foreclosure of mortgages that are not securitized. And there's also evidence that, this strategic default problem is a real problem once you start reworking. So this last paper has shown that, and this was with a settlement, I think with Countrywide, or no, it wasn't Countrywide, it was one of those. Anyway, there was a settlement where there was a lot of reworking of loans, and they found that there was a lot more default after that happened. So this is the beginning of the model. So now we're going to talk about one borrower, one lender. And now I'll talk about more assumptions that, just to simplify this so we can get something that's tractable. Our mortgage problem is just 2 periods. At time 0, they borrow the money, and at time 1, they have to pay it back. That simplification rules out a whole bunch of interesting things, but things we don't want to deal with. There's no real option problem of deciding when to default. At time 1, you either default or you pay, and that's that. Also, the cash flow for the borrowers doesn't matter. All that matters is the value of the underlying collateral. So that simplifies things a lot. In fact, we can look down here. A borrower will default. V is the value of the underlying collateral. So the borrower will default if that value is lower than what they had promised before to pay. A borrower may default if it's higher. And that's what we call a strategic default. So it's a slightly different use of the term than what you see in practice. In the popular press, and what people say, they talk about strategic default as being when someone has enough cash to pay, but they default because the underlying value of their collateral is low. But conceptually, it's the same idea, and that here we might have default because somebody knows something that the servicer or the lender doesn't know, and they're hoping to get a reworked mortgage, a lower payment. So at time 0, mortgage contract is signed, and the exogenous thing there is the prior expected value of the collateral. Endogenous, what we're solving for, B stands for bond, so the amount that they'll loan. And we just assume that a lender, at time 0 is willing to loan as much as what they think this thing is worth at that time, as long as they can break even an expected value at time 0. And R0 is the promised payment. R0 is due at time 1. The reason we call it R0 is because you make that promise at time 0. We'll have R1 on the next page, which might be a reworked payment at time 1. At time 1, the first thing that happens is the borrower observes the realization of V. Oh, also at time 0, there's no asymmetric information. That's another way of saying we're assuming away any origination problem. So origination is fine. Everybody knows, has the same information at time 0. I've done this funny diagram here. I've thought a lot of ways of how to present this, where I've got a timeline and then the beginning of a game tree. So what happens at time 1 is where things get interesting. We're going to have a full-fledged game tree at time 1. So let's look at that. First thing that happens, the borrower moves first and either defaults or pays R0. If the borrower pays, the game's over and we're done. Nature moves next. With probability 1 minus gamma, the lender also learns V. There's no asymmetric information. Remember, the lender learns this after the borrower has defaulted. And with probability gamma, the lender doesn't learn. At this stage of the analysis, that gamma is completely exogenous. So our objective in this stage of the analysis is really to figure out what happens in this game as a function of gamma, and also to say something about the value of information. That's all we want to do now. When we move forward to talk about the servicer, then we can put in a cost and do the trade-off of cost and value. So then once the lender either learns or doesn't, and let's go to the upper branch, if the lender actually learns V, well, the lender has a decision. The lender can either foreclose or make a renegotiated offer, but it's pretty clear-cut. If the lender knows for certain what this thing is worth, the lender is going to demand full value. Right? And the borrower pays it. Right, so that's an easy thing to figure out going up in the top one. And that V, that R1 can actually be larger than R0. And let's talk about that in practice. You know, all those fees that people get hit with if they're late on a mortgage payment or they default or whatever, they get hit with lots of fees. If they eventually want to work things out and get this mortgage up and running and hang on to their house, they do end up paying more than what they originally promised. And this is actually turns out to be something of a credible threat with regard to maybe discouraging strategic default, is the possibility of being able to actually get more out of a borrower. So as soon as that borrower defaults, the power then moves, to make decisions move to the lender. If the lender doesn't observe V, well, then things get a little more interesting. The lender might foreclose right away, or the lender might make an offer, and now we write that as R naught minus X. Again, X could be positive or negative. We actually show that as long as gamma is not equal to 1, that is, as long as there's any possibility that the lender will actually find out, discover a strategic defaulter, X is strictly positive. So then there are concessions offered. The concession is bigger if there's, a smaller chance, if gamma is smaller, right? Because then this threat of, I might find out if you're a strategic defaulter becomes stronger, if there's a greater chance that you'll actually learn it. So the solution depends on the information strategy. And so even though I said we take it as given, we then solve this as a function of all different possible strategies where gamma, it really epitomizes that. So if the lender is certain to not learn V, right? And let's foreshadow what's going to be coming down the line. If we know that our servicers don't have contracts that provide them with incentives to do much of anything that can't be observed, then we know that the lender is not going to learn anything, right? And that greatly affects the incentives for defaulting. So anyways, if he's not going to learn V and the lender is willing to renegotiate, then all borrowers default. That's the optimal thing to do. So then the lender does no renegotiation. That's the optimal thing to say. I will not renegotiate at all unless the original payment was too high. And so we actually show there's something, we call this a renegotiation cutoff value. So if you'd set that R not too high to begin with, you then would lower it to this thing we call R no inf, means no information gathered. That concept is going to be important because once we get to this non-diversified security and we can actually get a piece of information that might be relevant for the whole pool, we can then update. And we might, another way of thinking it is you update that value of R no inf. So if that thing, because of something you'd learned that's really relevant for the whole pool, gets lower, it may be optimal to do an across-the-board reworking. But other than that, there's no reworking of mortgages. If the lender has a probability, if that's strictly greater than 0 of learning what the true value is of the collateral, even if the lender doesn't learn it, the lender will make a concession in order to decrease. And it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off between wanting to decrease the probability of foreclosure versus transferring too much wealth to the borrower by lowering things too much. Credit availability is increasing in 1 minus gamma. That means the amount that a lender is willing to loan in the first place. Cost of borrowing is decreasing, so R naught is decreasing. If they're going to do better information gathering, I'm going to skip that. So quick summary of where we are so far. Information gathering is valuable for all these reasons. Decreases the incidence of inefficient foreclosure, decreases the incidence of strategic default, decreases the cost of borrowing, increases the availability of credit. So now, let's securitize this thing and add the servicer. So we have to add a few more assumptions. The servicer could expend a cost C to observe V with probability 1 minus gamma. If he doesn't expend this cost C, then the probability of learning any information is 0. And I'm going to assume that C is less than the value of information. So just this notation I have there. Again, B just stands for bond, the value of the mortgage bond. So B gamma is the value of the mortgage bond if you're going to gather information, minus what it's worth if you know there will be no information gathering. And so we'll just assume that information gathering is valuable. If it's not valuable, we can all go home because then there's no moral hazard problem because you don't want to gather information anyways. So what that assumption just means is that in a first best world, this information would be gathered. Investors cannot directly observe what the servicer is doing. We're assuming risk neutrality. We actually were assuming risk neutrality before. Thanks. And the servicer is wealth constrained. So there's our incentive compatibility constraint. Z is the fraction of the mortgage-backed security you've got to give to them. And it's a very standard result there. It's just the ratio of the cost to the benefit. It's the fraction you got to give to them. One thing I want to mention here is, if you've been reading any of the newspaper articles and stuff about these problems, this is a vertical risk position. Right? So if you tranche this, you might not need to go fully vertical, but you still need to be vertical. It's not a first loss. It's not that first loss position that's gone, and once it's gone, there are no incentives. Basic contract theory, requirement is that what this agent gets has to be, the value of what he gets has to be sensitive to his actions, right? And so a basic result is if you give them a first loss position that disappears as soon as things go sour, then the servicer is holding nothing that's at all sensitive to his actions. Incentive compatibility constraint is binding. As soon as we assume that C was less than what I've got there in the denominator, the thing is binding. IR just stands for individual rationality. So what I'm saying here is, if this servicer wasn't at all wealth constrained, you could actually require the servicer to buy in to the mortgage-backed security. And this is how much the servicer would be willing to pay for it. And it kind of just falls out in this nice, very simple thing that he would be willing to pay what it would be worth if he didn't work. So he'll pay that much for his share of the mortgage-backed security. And then he gets something more valuable if he works. And he has incentives to work. And that's great if he's not wealth constrained. But that thing could be gigantic, right? That could be a lot more than he's willing to pay. Well, it turns out that the investors don't need him to pay quite that much. And that's his W ask. W ask is what he would be willing to pay if he weren't wealth constrained minus this other term here. And all that comes from is it says they want at least this much. If investors don't get him to pay in at least this much, then investors would be giving up too much. If they just gave away that share of the mortgage-backed security, that's more costly than the benefit they get out of him working. And they say, forget it. We're just going to hire this guy to, collect money when it comes in and pass it on and things. We're just going to hire him to do things that we can check on anyways. We're not going to hire him to do anything that we can't check on. That WS could be negative. If the C is really small, the W ask is negative, so you don't need any money from him at all. But as soon as that C gets to be, that ratio gets closer to 1, then this thing gets pretty big, and it doesn't take much for this guy to be wealth constrained. So if we have, some upper limit on how much he can pay to buy into this thing, and it's got to be his own money that he's putting at risk, because we want him to have incentives to do this. We're not talking about him going out and raising money and having limited liability on the money he raised from somebody else. He's got to put his own cash at risk there. So if this wealth constraint is binding, the servicer is not offered an incentive compatible contract. Investors are better off if there are no renegotiations. And this is an important point. Oh, that's why I loved it when this came across the news this morning. If renegotiation is mandated, for example, by the government, then this will result in excess strategic defaults. Any renegotiation offer without information collection has to be made pool-wide. So again, if you want to even mandate these things, why not organize these things in pools that are similar as possible? We all know it's a basic result in finance that investors, if you securitize things, investors can do their own diversification by buying bits and pieces of lots of different securities. You don't need to diversify within the security itself. And if you don't diversify, then if you have 100 different securities, you can do pool-wide reworking on 2 or 3 of them and leave the rest of them alone. But when you've got them all mixed up, it becomes very difficult to do. So here's the design thing, and that equation up there isn't exactly what we do. I put that up there for illustration points, but think of it as there being 2 types of risk within the value of each collateral. One would be type. By type, I really mean type of the collateral. And so the best example would be they're all in the same zip code. So a diversified design, each mortgage-backed security has 1 loan of each type. So we have N by N mortgages. And in a non-diversified, each mortgage-backed security has loans only of 1 type. So that means in a non-diversified, they all realize the same outcome of UT. So in a diversified mortgage-backed security, the servicer has complete control over information production. If servicers are sufficiently wealth-constrained, organizing mortgages in this manner effectively makes the mortgages renegotiation-proof. And from what we showed with one borrower and one lender, that's not optimal. Renegotiation-proof means every default has to go to foreclosure. In non-diversified, you can actually learn this type information. And actually here, I'm gonna go way back to what I did here. That type information basically gives you a different value for R no inf. You can put RT in there instead, right? And if that RT is lower than the R naught, then it's Pareto improving to just rework the entire pool. But you're more likely to get that if you have a pool that's as similar as possible, so this piece of type information is actually something significant for the whole pool. So I'll skip that one too. We do solve this all with uniform distributions, and I'm doing that simply because there's truncation out the wazoo in this whole thing, and I really, any of you have looked at my other stuff, this is the most complicated model I've ever done, and it still has the shortest appendix I've ever had, and so I do have a little bit of pride of that. But the trade-off of that is actually choosing some very simple, the simplest possible distributions to illustrate all of this. So yeah, so the R type byte, if it's lower than R no inf, you do across the board reworking. So this is what you get out of designing it that way, and just the 3 bullet points. The maximum amount that a borrower can borrow relative to the expected collateral house value is higher. Once you roll the whole thing back to the original mortgage thing, the cost of borrowing is lower. The promised payment relative to everything else is lower, and the incidence of foreclosure is lower. So just in summary, renegotiation of mortgage contracts following default is Pareto improving, but only if the lender is able to obtain updated information. Contracts that provide servicers with sufficient incentives to obtain information will allocate a share of the proceeds to the servicer. If the servicer is sufficiently wealth constrained, the investors may find it suboptimal to do that. Foreclosure is sufficiently inefficient and servicers are wealth constrained, then you're better off organizing your mortgages into non-diversified pools for securitization. And all else equal, we should see the lowest amount of foreclosure if you're organizing your securities in that way. I just want to talk very briefly about some additional discussion on this. Contagion is this problem where, one mortgage goes in the neighborhood, one house goes into foreclosure in the neighborhood and other houses drop in value, and then you get other ones foreclosing and ongoing problem. That requires some coordination. Organizing these things in diversified pools just really makes that coordination. Stopping that would require coordination, which you can't get with diversified pools. The other thing about having this, across the pool reworking is you actually could contract on this ahead of time. You could actually then make the reworking contractable. Because you could make this, based on things that could actually be measured. So you could actually put this into a PSE, a pooling and service agreement. Those are the big contracts. If you've ever looked at them, they're pretty thick contracts that govern the way the mortgage-backed security works and also says what the servicers are supposed to do. That could help take care of things like tranche warfare, because you actually have contracted on it ahead of time. Tranche warfare is where different, holders of different tranches don't want to have a reworking. The other thing it can help out with is the underinvestment problem. So, and something I didn't address in this paper, but there's definitely an underinvestment problem in here that if homeowners, don't want to put a lot into their houses because, then I no longer get a reworking because I've made my house more valuable, so I don't deserve a reworking, but my neighbor who didn't work on his house gets a lower mortgage. But if you're going to actually be doing reworking based on this pool-wide information as opposed to individual information, then you also get rid of that particular underinvestment effect problem. There is the alternative, though, that the one downside is that well-designed tranching may actually ease the servicer's wealth constraint because it would not require the servicer to hold quite as valuable a piece of the whole security, or the whole pool.